Hello, today's subject is the Spanish flu, which took place in 1918 at the end of World War I, at the time when American troops joined the Allies, the British and French, in the trenches of France, fighting against the Germans. And immediately prior to that event, there was a gathering of young Americans, young American men, all of them young, from 18 through 20 up to maybe into their 30s, and these gathered at various points in the United States and went through training, because most of these were raw recruits. Some of them were drafted, but many were volunteers. And then subsequently they were shipped out to France, to Brest, the port of Brest. And what happened was that a mysterious disease struck, and this spread from one gathering point, one hotspot in the United States, to many, and then these troops, many of whom were already infected, were shipped overseas to the war. And during that whole process, many soldiers got ill, very ill, some, and there were deaths, many deaths. And then shipping out, they met other soldiers who were basically healthy at that point, but then became infected. Reaching the French shore, they then spread this infection to other troops, to the civilian French population, and this went on. It spread to the other troops, including the enemy, the German troops. It spread into the civilian populations in Western Europe, into Germany, eventually reached up into Scandinavia, also into the European part of Russia, and a little bit later on, when the British troops were returning to the UK, it spread into the UK. Eventually, this disease spread all over the world. It became a global pandemic, and millions died. In fact, in India alone, it's estimated 10 million people died. The total death is estimated between 40 and 50 million. If you just look at the US and the troops, and their return in late 1918, at the end of the war, to the US, the total death toll in the United States was around 675,000. This disease basically could cause relatively mild symptoms, but often it was very severe, and the symptoms over time seemed to change. There were even examples of something which resembled hemorrhagic fever. Nothing really had been seen like it in the history of disease. Some people even related it to the Black Death, thought maybe it was plague, but it wasn't. It turned out it was due to a virus. It was an influenza virus strain, which we now know is H1N1. And this particular virus strain, H1N1, is still with us to the present day. In fact, there was a pandemic in 2009, and again, the strain causing it was H1N1, Pan 09. So it's a pandemic in 2009. It was milder than the one that caused the Spanish flu. Okay, how do we know that it was H1N1? Well, this is a long story, but eventually it was possible to recover post-mortem sample from a woman who'd been buried in the frozen tundra, and they were able to isolate tissue, lung tissue, and then in turn find the virus, and then they were able in turn eventually develop the whole sequence of that virus. And in very recent times they were actually even able to construct a synthetic version, so they were able to reconstruct the live virus. So they, at this point, they know a great deal about this virus. So this was the worst example of a pandemic in the history of mankind. Black Death and the plagues were bad enough, but this was in an order of its own, and it was highly infective. It caused a lot of deaths. The speed of development of the symptoms in some cases was within 24 hours from when you first saw someone with symptoms to the death of that person. What happened, and this is a lesson in terms of how to handle pandemics, what happened was that when the troops returned, they brought back this virus, this infection, and then it spread throughout the United States, and also those ships that brought the troops back also went out to South America, to Canada, and into Asia. So those ships were also responsible for further spread to other parts of the world. So back here in the United States, the most severe epidemic was in fact the second one. It's often called the second wave, and there's an interesting story here because different cities in handling this adopted different stands. And in Philadelphia, for instance, the city fathers wanted to have a victory parade. It was the end of the First World War, so they wanted a parade through the city. They were cautioned by the experts at the time not to do this, but you know, the weight of enthusiasm for the end of the war was such that they went ahead, and literally within days after this parade, the virus struck, and thousands of people got ill and died. And in fact, the city progressively was more and more decimated by it. There were whole families where parents, for instance, would die and the children were left without adults and subsequently starved to death if they were young children. There's just a whole list of horror stories here. Basically, the deaths occurred so fast and there were so many that in the end there were not enough people to even kind of give a decent burial for those that were struck down by this virus, and many bodies were just held in the houses where they died or stacked up in alleys at the side of the house, and it took a long time before they were able to deal with this, and actually bodies were left at the front of the dwellings and then were collected and then were taken, and there was a mass burial of the dead. So the whole city stank of death. So it's a pretty dramatic story. It's very true, and there's a salutary lesson there that it's very important when you have an infection of this type to basically go into quarantine, to separate people, and those certainly that are healthy should stay isolated, quarantined, and you need to handle those that are infected best you can. They need obviously urgent medical attention. In many cases they may die. but still, you need people there who know in the main what they can do. The death rates in a lot of these situations were so great that there was no way to keep patients apart. They were crowded together because of, a lack of adequate facilities. So patient upon patient, and obviously that led to infection of the people looking after them. So many of the nurses and doctors also succumbed to this disease. That story is repeated through the United States, with one notable exception. In California, San Francisco, the mayor had heard about this, understood what needed to be done, and actually already put the city into quarantine before the infection arrived. And so they were very lucky in that they had someone that understood enough about pandemics and the type of threat they present, and was able to put in measures before the infection had arrived that prevented its spread. Now, sadly, there had been two waves. The first, which was in Europe, or may have started in the United States, and then the second wave was when these troops returned. It's called the second wave, and then there was actually a third wave, and this third wave was less damaging. Still, people died, but it was nothing like the second wave. There are a lot of theories about whether all these waves were with the same virus, or maybe the second wave was a different virus. We know that these types of viruses now readily mutate, that there were mutations which accounted for the different virulences of the infection in those separate waves. But the truth is, the only virus which we've been able to characterize is the one from the second wave. So it's purely hypothetical, theoretical, what the first wave was caused by, and then subsequently, after the major second wave, which caused so much damage, what the third wave was. Was it the same virus as the second wave? As time's gone on, we've had several cases, including the 2009 pandemic, which was also H1N1, and there have been others prior to that. So actually H1N1 was the fourth, in terms of those that are known, the fourth example of an H1N1 pandemic. And this N1 virus is still with us to the present day. The vaccines have been produced. So in the case of H1N1, potentially we already know, the approach to develop a vaccine, which is good news. How effective any of these vaccines will be was obviously tested with the 2009 epidemic, and whether it would be equally effective with a new version of H1N1 has yet to be determined. But the point about this is that H1N1 is only one possibility of many different possibilities with this type of virus. And so even if you produce a vaccine for H1N1, it may not be H1N1 next time. It may be another influenza virus, and then the vaccine may not be effective. So one of the goals of people that work with vaccines is to produce what's called a universal vaccine, which will be effective against all strains of the influenza A virus. Well, this hasn't happened yet, but sometime in the future, hopefully, they are able to produce such a virus. It was thought through in the 1970s that pandemics of this type were a thing of the past, but in more recent years there have been several alarming occurrences. Of course, the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, but in that same decade up to the present day, a new coronavirus emerged, and there have been two pandemics. One was MERS, M-E-R-S, which occurred first in the Middle East, and the second one was SARS, S-A-R-S, and it luckily was relatively mild, and a vaccine was produced, but before it was needed, the pandemic had ceased. But people were very aware that either coronavirus, a new coronavirus perhaps, or a more virulent strain of one that's already been characterized could occur. It could be a new influenza virus, or indeed it could be some other type of virus. And in fact, there was a scare in recent times where Ebola, which causes hemorrhagic fever, which has been a problem in Africa on and off for many years, that it actually reached the United States in recent times. And luckily, because the scientists at the CDC had been working with it and had developed, an effective approach to handle this as soon as it occurred, they had the experience to deal with it, and they were able, in fact, to contain it. Even though it entered the United States, they were able to actually contain it before it could cause any major damage. But had it, in fact, spread, this is one of the worst diseases known. I mean, basically you bleed to death, and had it spread like COVID-19 has spread, it would be the ultimate disaster for any country that would actually be infected by it. So I think viruses obviously are something that should be tackled up front and immediately. And unfortunately, what's happening now with this new SARS-CoV-2 virus is that we've left it too late. And that's particularly here in the United States, also in the United Kingdom. It looks like in Russia it's the same. And unbelievably, in the United States, many states are already opening up the communities, opening up their states, and creating a situation where it's almost inevitable there will be a second wave, and predictably this could easily be worse than the first wave. And in fact, beyond that, unless there's more containment and more resolute action to stall the spread of this virus, there could be multiple waves of this disease. Well, on that piece of good news, I'll be talking again about influenza virus, about H1N1, and some other influenza viruses, a follow-up to the Spanish flu, which until now was the worst pandemic in the history of the world. Bye.